So today we're going to be talking about carbohydrates. What exactly they are chemically and what exactly they do to your body. Okay, so let's get started and let's talk about carbohydrates. This is another one of our macronutrients that's important for health. And I think that traditionally we think about carbohydrates as sugar, which is definitely they are carbohydrates, but we don't often recognize the other forms of carbohydrates, such as fruits, which are very, very high in carbohydrates. We have certainly carbohydrates in milk. We have lactose there. We even have carbohydrates in things like vegetables. So it's not always just the starches that have carbohydrates in them. So we're gonna break up carbohydrates into groups, and we're gonna find out pretty quickly that carbohydrates, like proteins, are just polymers. So they're repeat units of these monomeric sugars, and so we can think of carbohydrates as either being just kind of monomers, in which case we call them the monosaccharides, and these are the sweetest types of carbohydrates that we recognize. These are our glucose and our fructose. These are things that are in white sugar or honey. We also have disaccharides, and as the name implies, this is two of these sugar units that have been linked together. This is certain forms of sugar, maltose, lactose. This is kind of the sugar in milk, and then finally we have long polymers of sugars, which people call cellulose or starches or glycogen, and these are sugars that are found. These are complex sugars that are found in breads and stuff like that. Okay, so biologically, the most immediate form of energy that we have in our body on a molecular perspective is glucose. And you can kind of see the picture of glucose right here. It's a whole bunch of carbons, has some oxygens interspersed into it, and some hydrogens. It's a ring-like structure, and we can metabolize this molecule, and we can chemically convert it into energy with relative ease. And we have, at any given moment, we have some free glucose kind of going around in our bloodstream. In fact, we can actually measure our blood glucose level quite easily, and you can kind of see this is a picture of a breakfast, lunch, and dinner day, and you can see that during these times, this person has eaten a good amount of glucose, and so their glucose level skyrockets and then kind of comes back down and stabilizes in their blood, and then it skyrockets again and kind of comes back down, and then they go to sleep and it kind of stabilizes. And so another word that you guys might have heard of, this is a protein. Insulin. Insulin is a protein in the blood that is responsible for controlling, among other things, how much glucose is in the blood. So you typically have an insulin type response to high levels of sugar. So you eat a lot of sugar and your body's going to release a lot of insulin, which is going to help control and bring that sugar back down, potentially by removing it from your bloodstream. And so when you talk about things like type 2 diabetes, this is a form of insulin resistance where your insulin is not operating, or at least your insulin is not allowing you to effectively remove the glucose from your blood. The question might be, where does glucose come from? Well, in fact, all the glucose pretty much in this world that we see is coming from plants for the most part. So even though animals can certainly make their own glucose from different things, we typically talk about this really important chemical reaction, photosynthesis. So photosynthesis is where plants will take in carbon dioxide, and then they'll take in water, and they'll do a series of chemical transformations inside their chloroplasts, inside their cells, and out will come sugar molecules. So you get glucose out. And they'll actually, as a byproduct of this process, they'll spit out oxygen, which we also find pretty important. And of course, they're making this because this is a good energy source for them as well. But they also utilize this as a structural component. So they actually build some of their cellular walls out of these sugars. Okay, so another really common monosaccharide is fructose. You can see it looks pretty similar to glucose. It's a 5-membered ring instead of a 6-membered ring now. And fructose to us is perceived as being much more sweet. And so when you talk about common caloric sweeteners, these are things that have been added to food to kind of add some sweetness to them. You're going to be seeing things like high fructose corn syrup, and this is basically liquid fructose that's been added to that was generated from corn, that's been added to Coca-Cola or candy or what have you. Okay, so when we talk about maybe sugar in a sugar bag, we're actually now beginning to talk about a disaccharide. And so you can see here we have not one, but two sugars that have been linked together now, and they're linked together through an oxygen atom. And so we actually have a glucose molecule bound to a fructose molecule. And together, the glucose and the fructose make a new molecule, and this is going to be sucrose. And this is our table sugar. And if you've ever had something like Splenda, Splenda is a non-caloric variant of sucrose, and you can kind of see what they've done here. They've actually chemically modified the sucrose molecule, and they put some chlorines in there. And so if you think about the molecular shape of this molecule, it's very similar. So this, to our tongue, to our taste, the receptors in our mouth, this has a very similar shape, and so it tastes sweet to us because our body is being tricked into thinking that it's getting sucrose, this white sugar. However, it's not metabolized. So when we actually ingest it, we don't really it doesn't get metabolized very easily into the energy, and so we tend to just pass it directly. And so this is a non-caloric or a low-caloric sweetener. Instead of sucrose. Lactose is another really common disaccharide, and lactose is composed of a galactose molecule, which is another monosaccharide that's been hooked on to a glucose molecule. And if you drink milk, milk is actually very high in sugar, and it just happens to be in a type of sugar that doesn't taste particularly sweet. That's lactose. You eat it, and then of course in your small intestine you have an enzyme, and this enzyme catalyzes the breakdown of lactose into galactose and glucose. And once they're in their monosaccharide form, then you can further digest them and get energy out of them. So if you lack this enzyme that breaks this disaccharide down, then you are unable to utilize this particular type of sugar for energy. You are lactose intolerant. You lack the lactase enzyme. And in fact, what happens in this case is that the lactose just passes through into your large intestine where you have a lot of microbes, and these bacteria will ultimately digest the lactose. They'll use it as their own energy source, and when they do that, they typically will produce carbon dioxide. They'll ferment it into acids, and this is ultimately causes a lot of discomfort for people who lack this enzyme. So believe it or not, we actually use sugars for more than just energy sources, in that many of the cells in our bodies are actually coated in sugars. And so we call these glycoproteins, glyco for sugar, and so you'll typically have this protein that's sticking out of your cell wall, and off of it will be a combination of little 6-membered or 5-membered rings. You can kind of see them right here. And what these actually are used for, they're used for cellular recognition. So the different combinations of sugar molecules will kind of sugarcoat the cells, and these will actually kind of allow cells to recognize other cells, or your immune system to recognize cells that belong to you. And maybe a common example of this might be your blood type. So what is blood type? Blood type is the fact that you have blood cells, these red blood cells, and these all have different sugars that are coating them. And so our immune system recognizes our own blood, and so if one of our immune cells interacts with a blood type that's actually not our own, it thinks it's an invader, and it actually actively goes out and it tries to destroy it, which is why you can't get a blood transfusion depending upon what your blood type is with certain blood types. Okay, so that was monosaccharides like glucose and fructose, and disaccharides like sucrose and lactose, and even some of these little bigger ones. And now we're going to talk about big polymers of just repeat over and over and over and over again of sugars. And one, of course, that we've heard of is starch. So starch is a whole bunch of glucose molecules that have been polymerized together, right? And so starchy vegetables are basically veggies that have linked up a whole bunch of the glucose molecules that they've made via photosynthesis, and they've made a big polymer out of them. And so that is starch, and that's starch as well, right? And so these starchy vegetables are often in the roots. You dig these up, so parsnips and yams and potatoes. Why? Because plants are storing this chemical energy of these glucose molecules, and they're storing it in their roots for later use. The question might be, do we have the ability to store sugar molecules for later use? And the answer is yes, we have our own version of starch. We call it glycogen. So glycogen isn't a straight polymer, it's actually kind of a twisty, twirly polymer of different sugar units. You can see that's a glucose, and that's a glucose, and it's linked down. Here's one, and here's one. So it kind of goes off in all directions. But we have glycogen storages in our muscles and in our liver. And so we can basically kind of use this to get energy when we're vigorously working out. And you might ask yourself, for instance, okay, so if I'm breaking down sugar to get energy out of it, and I have a certain amount of glycogen in my muscles, and I have a certain amount in my liver, and I have a tiny bit of glucose in my blood that's kind of freely flowing around, how much sugar do I have in my body? And the answer is you have about 2,000 calories. And so if you've ever wondered where the heck that number came from, that you should eat about a 2,000 calorie diet, the answer is that you have about 2,000 calories worth of glycogen in your body. And when you use it up, you use it up, and you're done for the day. And so a great example of this for those of you who have run marathons is that it takes about 20-something miles of running and to use up about 2,000 calories of glycogen. And so we call it the wall. So people who do marathons, they hit the wall, and they have literally used up all of their sugar in their body. And they no longer have energy sources, and they basically kind of stumble around a little bit. Now, we're going to talk about fats in a little bit, and we can also use fat as a source of our energy, and that's ultimately what happens with those runners, is that they're able to kind of switch over to begin burning on fat. But for most of us, if you don't want to gain any weight, then you want to take in about 2,000 calories of food, depending upon kind of how big you are, and that'll correspond to basically about how much energy you have to spend in your muscles and in your liver every day. Okay, so I mentioned that plants also they make glucose not only as an energy source, but they actually make it as a structural source. So plants make a different polymer of glucose units, and so you can kind of see them here once again. And they actually link them up in a different way, and they link them up in a slightly different way that makes the polymer cellulose. And we actually can't digest cellulose. We call this fiber. And so when you're eating celery, for instance, celery is almost exclusively cellulose. It's almost entirely the plant cell walls that you're eating. If we had the enzymes that could in fact break these down, we would be able to get all of that energy out of it, but we simply don't. And so for us, it just is undigested plant mass, and it helps our digestive process out. But for plants, they're going to be using it as a structural material. Okay, so lastly, since we're talking about what we should be consuming, and we were talking about in the last time about essential versus non-essential proteins in our diet, let's talk about carbohydrates in our diet and the problem with carbohydrates. And that really is that, especially in the last 30 years or so, that 1 in 3 adults have become obese. And in fact, the number of children who become obese is skyrocketed. And it used to be that the U.S. Department of Agriculture recommended primarily our diet be carbohydrate based. So 6 to 11 servings of rice and bread and pasta. And it used to be that we feared we feared fats. So you can see up here, fats and oils. Use them sparingly. Don't eat them and stuff like that. Because the old way of thinking was that if you ate fat, that you got fat. So we should stick to carbohydrates. Well, that turns out to be a bunch of crap, actually, and it's been pretty much debunked absolutely everywhere. So eating fat does not necessarily make you fat. However, eating carbohydrates certainly will make you fat because one of the things that happens is if you eat more carbohydrates than you need in your diet, one of the very first things you do is you actually will chemically convert the carbohydrates into fat. So right now, the USDA has altered their recommendations, and so you can kind of see this is the new one. And now instead of this pasta being the major part, it's now a smaller part. But in fact, actually, if you begin talking to a lot of nutritionists, additionally, Harvard recently came up with a different plate. You'll notice that grains is taking an increasingly smaller and smaller and smaller role to things like vegetables and protein and dairy.